Hello, everyone. Manoga Jep. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are, as Erin had said. I'm so excited to be here with you all today. I do apologize that my camera is currently off. My internet isn't as stable as I wish it was. And so, in order to let this move smoothly, I've turned my camera off. I'm going to introduce myself first in my language because that's extremely important to me. So anin bojo buju Shanese Indishnakas, Ndobo to go Anishnabemnang, Jajakandodem. Anishnabe Makade Meti Kwe, Toronto Dunjaba Minwa Nabising Dunjaba, Debenjane Nakuya Potawatomi. So I said, hello, my name is Shanice Ndobo Steele. My Anishinaabe name, Ndobo, means to carry the ceremony. I'm Crane Clan. I'm of Afro-Indigenous heritage. So my father hails from Trinidad and Carriacou, Grenada. And my mom is Métis Nabising or Métis Nipissing. And I'm coming to you from the traditional territory of the Potawatomi people here in Decatur, Illinois. I'm currently visiting my partner, but usually I'm on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people at Dopakong or North York, as you might have known. I might have heard of it. And you might have heard of Dopakong before in the form of Etobicoke. So that's the anglicized version of the word. And Edopakong refers to a place of many trees. And every time I give people that description of North York, folks are a little confused because when we think of Toronto, we think of concrete buildings, concrete sidewalks, of skyscrapers, of buildings. We don't really think of the land in that way. And actually, when my grandmother grew up in North York, it still very much was farmland. It still very much was a place of many trees. A lot of people don't know that Yorkdale Mall actually used to be the Toronto airport. And so that land there was cultivated in a very different way than what we see now. And so it's important for me to acknowledge that connection to land is still there, even though we see the concrete above it. Being here in Decatur, Illinois has also been interesting. It's, as I said, it's the traditional territory of the Potawatomi people. And yet the Potawatomi people have been displaced from these lands. And so being a visitor to these lands, also Anishinaabe, as the Potawatomi are themselves, it's interesting to see, little bits and pieces of the people that were here before. I always talk about when I first got here, I was seeing these little red plants on the ground and I didn't know what they were, these little red berries. And my friend had joked with me that I was a bad Anishinaabe because I didn't recognize them as wild strawberries. And so it's important to acknowledge the things on the land that we sometimes forget as being traditional, as being connection to communities and people. It's easy to forget the traditional people of the lands when you don't see them there. And so I want people to be cognizant of that, to think of that. When you're looking around and you're seeing the outside and maybe you're taking a walk, to remember that there were people there before you that still have those connections to those lands, even if it might look a little different. So today we're going to be talking about Indigenous solidarity. And I know sometimes being in solidarity with community can sound scary, right? You don't want to say the wrong thing. You don't want to do the wrong thing. You want to show up in the right ways. And I'm not going to say that this is going to be an end all be all. This presentation isn't the only way that you can be in solidarity with Indigenous communities, but we're going to unpack ourselves a little bit, which is really important. Every time I talk to folks about how to truly be in solidarity with people, unpacking yourself first is where I always start. And so we're going to move through this presentation. There's going to be opportunities for you to participate. I'm hoping folks will feel comfortable to unmute their mics, to give answers. There's a little activity in the beginning, but I'm excited to be in community here with you all today. We're going to take a quick moment of silence for the children whose lives have been lost. We're seeing more and more burial grounds being found on former residential schools. And so it's important for me to take a moment to just honor those lives that were lost. So we're going to take about a minute if folks can just be silent for that time. Thank you. I want to thank everybody who took that moment to sit with themselves and reflect for a second. It's important that we take that time to acknowledge those children and those lives lost. Um, Parents didn't have their children come home. Grandparents didn't see their grandchildren again. And it's important to acknowledge that hard history, but the fact that, you know, it happened and we need to find a way to move from that into a good way and being in community with each other. So the agenda for today, I'm going to talk about my positionality, which is super important. We're going to talk about who are the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. You might know who they are, but there might be some stuff about them that you don't necessarily know. We're going to talk about colonization and its effects. We're going to talk about, am I a settler? Because for a lot of racialized and immigrant folks, conversations around whether or not you're a settler can feel confusing. And then we're going to talk about how you can be in solidarity. So my positionality, who am I? What work have I done? What does this mean to me? It's important for me to acknowledge my positionality in this conversation because I want you to know where I'm coming from. As an Afro-Indigenous person, someone of mixed heritage, solidarity is extremely important for my community, for my identity, for people who want to be in community with me. I've been doing this work for about 11 years now, and I say that and I'm like, wow, this really, really has been a long time. But when I think about how I've been doing activism, it's been a lot longer than 11 years. But officially within the nonprofit sector, with facilitation and workshops, it's been 11 years. And a lot of my work was focused in the earlier days around access to education, solidarity within the education sector. And then I realized a lot of people weren't having access to these conversations outside of post-secondary spaces, right? Oftentimes these conversations are happening in small silos and small groups with people who usually already kind of have a know or an understanding of the topic. And so I wanted to know what it was like to have conversation with people who didn't always have access to this information. And so that's what brought me to facilitating and doing workshops outside of the education sector. Though I would still say I'm doing education. It's important for me, for people to be in solidarity with Indigenous peoples because we all share these lands together. We are all in relationship together. We are all in community together. In the type of society that we're in now, it's very individualistic. This idea that we are separate from each other, that what happens to me doesn't affect others. But the reality is that we are all in community with each other. Me and you on this call right now are in community with each other. And it's important for us to know how to do that in ways that aren't harmful. And so that's my positionality within this conversation. So we're going to get into the Indigenous people of Turtle Island. Now, I'm sure most of you know the terms that we use are First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And it's important to make that distinction. Yes, they are all, or we are all Indigenous peoples, but we come from various different cultural backgrounds, languages, spiritualism, understanding and relationship to the land. I always say that what works for someone in Nunavut might not work for a Mi'kmaq person on the East Coast, which might not work for someone who's Coast Salish, which might not work for someone who's Métis and living on the prairies. It's important to acknowledge that there's a difference between these three communities, and even still differences within these communities. Indigenous people in Canada are not pan-Indigenous. We don't all believe the same things or think the same things. And so it's important when being in solidarity with Indigenous people that you understand this, that you understand that there is a complexity to Indigenous identity. So first is First Nations, and they're defined as Indian under the Indian Act. And now you might say, hey, Shanese, that's an outdated term. And yes, it is. But for the purpose of understanding it within the Canadian context and in relationship to Canadian law, First Nation peoples, again, are defined as Indian under the Indian Act. The term First Nations was first used in the 70s and 80s. And so you might see different terms used throughout time. You might hear older generations use different terms to refer to themselves. And you might meet Indigenous people from other places in the world, or even within Turtle Island, that refer to themselves as something different. So you might meet someone who's indigenous and lives in the United States, and they might refer to themselves as Native American, right? We all have different terms that we use to identify ourselves. First Nation folks also have treaties with the Crown, and it's important to acknowledge that there's treaties versus settlements or land claims. They also have reserves. So First Nations communities are the only ones that have reserves. And it's important to acknowledge that because we're going to get in a little bit later about how the reserve system has negatively affected Indigenous peoples. Up next is Métis. And so the Métis people are people who are mixed with First Nation and European descent. It might be Scottish or French, but it's also important to acknowledge that Métis, the term Métis refers to a specific group of people, and that someone who is born today, who's Cree and maybe French, it doesn't automatically make them Métis. Métis people have a distinct culture, language, Michif, distinct customs, and it's important to acknowledge that. The term Métis was legally defined in 2003 during the Paoli case, and the Paoli case refers to a father and son who were hunting. They were asserting their traditional rights as Métis people and yet were fined. And so they fought against that fine. And during that time, the term Métis was legally defined within Ontario and within Canada. Also, Métis people have settlements and road allowances versus reserves. So if you're in Alberta or you've been to Alberta, you might have heard of the Métis settlements. There's, I believe, about 7 of them. And so that's the difference between reserves, First Nation folks who have reserves and Métis people who have settlements. Road allowances or script was also given to Métis communities during the time of the Red River settlement being burned down in what is Manitoba. Up next is Inuit. So Inuit are the Indigenous peoples of Northern Alaska, Arctic Canada, and Greenland. And many folks oftentimes forget that the Inuit are also found in Newfoundland, Northern Newfoundland. They have modern treaty and land claim agreements. And so that's where we get the territory of Nunavut. That was a modern land claim agreement. And it's also important to acknowledge that Inuit means plural, Inuk means singular. So when you're referring to Inuit, if you have one friend, they are Inuk. My friend always likes to make fun of me. She is Inuk, and she talks about when you say Inuit people, you're really saying people, people. Inuit means people, and it's important to remember that. Also, Inuit territory or Inuit Nunangat is made up of 4 Inuit regions: Nunatsiavut, Nunavut, Nunavut, and Inuvialuit. And these span across what is Canada. Again, it's important to remember that Inuit territory is also found in Greenland and in Alaska. So we're going to talk about colonization and its effects. So colonization is the action or process of settling among and establishing control over the Indigenous people of an area. It is also the action of appropriating a place or domain for one's own use. It's super interesting. I've seen like really funny memes where people talk about, it's like going into someone's home and saying, I now live here. This is now my home, right? That is what colonization is. And sorry, thank you for the correction in the chat. It's Northern Labrador, not Northern Newfoundland. I do apologize for that. Thank you. The Yukon is included a bit, but I believe there's also a lot of Dene communities in the Yukon. And so I tend to take direction from the Inuit, from what they've described as their traditional territories. But I do believe one of the territories does span across Yukon, Northern West Territories. And so I think what I'll do is at some point, I will send Aaron a map of Inuit Nunangat so that folks can also see the regions and where they spread across. So this is a timeline of colonization of Turtle Island and Inuit Nunangat. And so I just want to say this is not a complete timeline. This does not outline every single time colonization has happened on these lands, but it's important to acknowledge kind of the key dates. So first is the arrival of Jacques Cartier in 1534. We then see a first settlement in 1605 in Port Royal, Nova Scotia, which is Mi'kmaq territory. Then in 1760, we see the conversion of Inuit to Christianity in Labrador, so Nunatsiavut. And it's important to acknowledge the way in which conversion to Christianity helped to further colonization on these lands. We then have the establishment of Upper Canada in 1791, and then Canada becomes a country in 1867. Now, again, this doesn't mean that colonization stopped or was completed in 1867 with the establishment of Canada. It just means that colonization has been happening on these territories for a very long time, almost 500 years. Right? So it's important to acknowledge that colonization is an ongoing thing, that the history of colonization is more than just a couple of hundred years ago, but in reality has been happening on these lands for centuries. So treaties are a prime example of colonization on these lands. A treaty is an official agreement or legal document between states, nations, or governments. And it's important to acknowledge that Indigenous communities, when signing these treaties, oftentimes felt it was a nation-to-nation relationship. Treaties outline different conditions to both parties involved. And so you might see differences in treaties, in the number of treaties based on the regions and the needs of those communities. And so again, that is a product of the area's history, social, and political environment. Treaties are the building blocks to the creation of Canada. You cannot have Canada without treaties. And the main intention of treaties in Canada, Crown and Indigenous nations, were entered into for the purpose of mutual benefit and a focus on peaceful relations. Now, that might have been the perspective of Indigenous nations. Oftentimes, Indigenous nations were forced to sign treaties because the Canadian government was withholding food or supplies. It's important to acknowledge that not every nation fully understood the treaty that they were signing. And so, unfortunately, at the time, translators didn't always translate the full extent of a treaty. And so it's important to acknowledge that while treaties did assert the rights and do assert the rights of certain Indigenous nations, they also at times bound the hands of Indigenous nations and their ability to move freely on the lands that they were from. And so this is a timeline of treaties. So nation-to-nation treaties were first entered actually between Indigenous nations on these lands. And so the primary reasons for these internal treaties was to allow for equitable and fair access to resources. If you've ever heard of wampum, so for an example, Toronto sits on the dish with one spoon wampum treaty. And it's important to acknowledge that because that was a treaty between Indigenous people on these lands. You might have also heard of wampums being used to enter into territories. So oftentimes when Indigenous nations were entering into the territory of another nation, they provided a wampum or a treaty. We then have the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and by law, First Nation peoples were recognized as sovereign nations, and therefore treaties had to be negotiated prior to settlement. And it's extremely important to point that out, that again, the idea was that these were nation-to-nation agreements. We then have pre-Confederation treaties prior to Confederation in 1867. And so you have peace and friendship treaties, which were established between First Nation peoples and the newcomers. There's a peace and friendship treaty that exists on the East Coast in Mi'kmaq territory. There's also the Two-Row Wampum. So if folks have heard of that before, the Truro Wampum is a treaty that was entered between the Haudenosaunee people and the Dutch settlers. And it looks like 2 rows of white and 2 rows of purple. And it refers to 2 rivers and 2 boats. And in one boat is the settlers, the Dutch settlers, people of European descent, visitors to these lands. And in the other boat is the Haudenosaunee people or indigenous people. And the idea is that we are both going side by side in this river down together in solidarity, never interrupting each other's paths. And those are some of the initial agreements that you saw happening on these territories. We then get into the numbered treaties that happened between 1871 to 1920, where treaty commissioners met with First Nation peoples throughout Northwestern Ontario and the Southern Prairies and were instructed to secure access to the land. And so that's where you see your numbered treaties. We also have named treaties in Northern Ontario, like the Robinson Superior, Robinson Huron treaties. And then we have modern day treaties like the Haida Gwaii treaties that are happening in BC and Western territories. And again, one of the most recent modern treaties is the treaty with Nunavut for us to have that territory. And so something that I want to ask folks to do, I'm going to give you about 3 to 5 minutes, is I want you to take some time to look into where are you located, what is your connection to it, what treaty or land claim do you fall under, and whose traditional territory is it? So remember at the beginning, I acknowledged where I was from, right? Adopakong, Anishinaabe territory, the dish with one spoon wampum. It's also under Treaty 13. So if you're located in Toronto, Hamilton, Mississauga, a lot of the GTA, you're going to be under the dish with one spoon wampum. You're going to be on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Wendat, and Haudenosaunee people. And so I'm going to mute myself for about, I'm going to say 4 minutes, because I think that's enough time to Google. And I'm going to allow folks to take the time to find out where you're located again, what is your connection to it. And then I'm going to ask folks to either unmute themselves or to post in the chat and just explain where you are and what's your connection to the land. What's your relationship? So I'm going to, let me open up my timer and I'm going to start now. All right, folks. So I've been reading the chat and I love to see that there's folks from all over. And I also love to see folks who are acknowledging the lands that they came from before coming here. My family is also from Trinidad, and I had a great opportunity to attend a Caribbean Indigenous Peoples Forum in St. Lucia and to hear from Carib and Arawak folks in Trinidad and their experiences as Indigenous people there as well. I also love to see folks who are living and working in different countries and acknowledging both of those territories. I thank you all for sharing, your relationship to the lands. So we have Anishinaabe territory, we have Salish territory, Saulteaux territory, Mi'kmaq territory, Haudenosaunee territory. And it's also awesome to see folks acknowledging that many nations have shared some of these territories and still do share these territories. Being Anishinaabe, it's always funny when you hear the elders joke back and forth with Haudenosaunee elders about whose traditional territory it originally was. They always poke jokes at each other, right? But it's important to acknowledge those relationships, to acknowledge that many nations have shared these places. Toronto was originally a meeting place for many nations. And I'm very thankful for folks sharing their connection to the land, what it means for them, how they are grateful to be visitors on these lands or sharing these lands, what it means to be invited and uninvited. Because that can be a hard conversation to have, to say I am an uninvited settler on these lands. And what does that mean? So thank you to everyone who has shared. Is there anybody who really wanted to unmute their mic before I move on? I'm not seeing anybody yet. So we're going to get into conflicting views. So many nations saw the making of treaties as a way to building relationships between settlers and indigenous communities. Indigenous people have a deep connection to the land and saw the land as something both indigenous peoples and settlers could share together respectfully. And that's based off of relationships that already existed on these lands. Many of you acknowledged, right, that many nations shared the territories that you are currently on. And so this establishment of sharing the land was already here. And so many nations went into these treaty signings or these agreements believing that that same level of respect and reciprocity would happen. They saw treaty making as creating equal partnerships and that nations would have their own sovereignty over their land and lives. And it's extremely important to remember that. Remember earlier, I said that this was seen as nation-to-nation agreements. And so nations believed that signing these treaties allowed them to have sovereignty over their people and their lands. And we see that that wasn't necessarily true. Thank you, Cassandra, for sharing that no treaties were made where you are. Acknowledging unceded land is extremely important. And even when we do say unceded or ceded, it's important to acknowledge that even when lands were signed over through treaties, it was not always done in ways that allowed indigenous people to have real relationships to the land. The Crown saw these treaties as a legal process to acquire First Nation lands, right? So you see the difference. Indigenous folks saw this as relationship building, as an agreement to share the land together, where the Crown viewed it as taking ownership. They saw it as securing an extinguishment of the Indian title to lands, which may be considered to be necessary in view of railway construction, advancing settlements, and etc. So that was the view of what it meant to secure these lands, right? This is extinguishment, of indigenous people's connection to it. And the government's main goal was to assimilate indigenous people to Euro-Canadian society. And so we saw this with laws that were in place, like if you wanted to attend university, you had to give up your Indian status or your indigenous identity. If you married, if you were a woman at the time and you married a non-indigenous man, then you lost your access to treaty. You lost your access to status. You lost your access to community. And so there was many laws put into place to ensure or to push indigenous people into assimilating into Euro-Canadian societies and ideals. So I want to ask you all, and you can put this in the chat or you can unmute yourself. I want to know, what are some ways that the government has broken treaty agreements? So from what you've heard or what you know, what are some ways? Remember how I said it was nation to nation building? It was about sharing the land together. What are some ways that the government has broken treaty agreements? Pipelines, Joshua, that's a great example. Taking away hunting rights and access to water, absolutely. Indigenous people were forced to no longer be dependent on the land, but dependent on other resources. I spent some time in Quechua First Nation and saw firsthand what it was like to not have access to water. Spencer, forcing people off the land and onto reserves. Absolutely. Many indigenous nations are living on reserves in territories where they would not have spent the entirety of the year. Right? It's important to acknowledge that. A lot of folks don't know that many of the extremely northern Inuit communities were forcibly put there by the Canadian government in order to establish ownership of the Arctic. And so when Inuit communities were put in these extremely northern Arctic regions and forced to stay there year round, many lost their lives to the extreme cold. So it's important to acknowledge that. Folks have said, let's see what else we see. Residential schools, absolutely, is a prime example of removing children and forcing them to assimilate. Access to treaty rights only being available on reserve, absolutely. The creation of reserves. Education support being inadequate. Many people don't know, but on reserves, schools receive $5,000 to $7,000 less per student than off-reserve schools. Removing freedom of movement. Yes, the pass system is an excellent example of that, and we're going to talk about that a bit later. The potlatch bans, absolutely. Federal government not providing equal medical care. Just last night, I was watching a story of a Nook man, a grandfather who's been forcibly confined to a facility, I would say, in Ontario, and does not have the access to fly back home because the government is saying it's going to cost $40,000. And they're trying to keep him in the South because they're saying there's no adequate facilities in Nunavut as of right now, though there is one being built in Rankin. Working to suppress language, spiritual, and cultural practices, absolutely. Forced relocation, starvation, slaughter of sled dogs. The 60s scoop, which a lot of people don't know about, surprisingly. But the 60s scoop is when over 20,000 Indigenous children were taken from their parents and put into foster care or up for adoption. The 1805 Toronto Purchase, absolutely. First Nation people do not get the right to self-determination, absolutely. The current foster care system. Even when we think about incarceration, as of right now, 50% of women incarcerated in Canada are Indigenous women, 50%. 36% of Indigenous youth are currently incarcerated in a federal facility. 36% of Indigenous youth. The Canadian government deciding who is First Nation and who is not. The differing ways of responding to Indigenous people standing up for their rights versus white settlers. The millennial scoop, losing status or land claim benefits if you move, leave the land claim area, agreement, blood quantums. Absolutely, all of these things are excellent examples of the way in which the government has broken treaty agreements. Missing and murdered Indigenous women, calls to actions being ignored, the TRC being ignored, right? We have all of these examples of the way in which the Canadian government has broken treaty agreements. So we talked about treaties, and we're going to talk now about Métis settlements. And it's important to acknowledge the Métis settlements, especially the way in which they came about. So replacing the previous Métis Betterment Act, the Métis Settlements Act provides for the legal transfer of land title to Métis people, local municipal and traditional style of government, and established 8 settlement corporations and the Métis Settlements General Council as legal entities. Now, I highly suggest reading the Métis Settlements Act so that you can get an understanding of the way in which the Alberta government viewed this agreement with the Métis community, the Métis Nation. I remember reading at some point they referred to the Métis Nation as children, as wards that needed to be taken care of by the Alberta government, not being seen as an actual nation. right? So it's important to acknowledge when we're reading these agreements and these treaties that the way in which the Canadian government or provincial governments or territorial governments are going into these agreements differentiate between the way in which Indigenous nations are. There are 8 Métis settlements in Alberta: Buffalo Lake, East Prairie, Elizabeth, Fishing Lake, Gift Lake, Kikono, Paddle Prairie, and Piavine. And these are the 8 settlements. It's important to acknowledge that there aren't settlements outside of Alberta. There was the Red River settlement, but due to colonization and anti-indigeneity, the Red River settlement was burnt down. And that's where we got things like road allowance and scrip. And much like treaties and reserves, these agreements were signed onto by the government in ways that weren't necessarily about reciprocity. And Métis communities, Métis settlements in Alberta are still currently fighting and advocating for their rights. So just because a community has a settlement or a treaty or a land claim does not mean that they aren't still facing issues of colonization. A lot of people don't know, and this goes back to the reserve system, that on reserve, people don't actually own their homes. You can live in that house for generations, but you don't actually own any rights to the house that you've built, that you live in, and that your family lives in. So even when we have settlements and reserves and communities, our connection to the homes that we built, to the communities that we built, are still infringed upon by the Canadian government. And so we talked about reserves, we talked about settlements, and I want to talk a bit about the Northwest Resistance. Now, you might have heard of it as the Northwest Rebellion, but we like to think of it as the Northwest Resistance. And so this was a 5-month resistance against the Canadian government's continued colonization and genocide of Indigenous peoples. It was fought mainly by Métis and their First Nation allies in what is now Saskatchewan and Alberta and parts of Manitoba. It was caused by the rising fear and insecurity among the Métis and First Nation people, as well as even white settlers, specifically Francophone settlers, of the rapidly changing West. And so a series of battles and other outbreaks of violence began in 1885 and left hundreds of people dead. Now, it's important to acknowledge that through the Northwestern Resistance, we had the creation of the Northwest Mounted Police, or the RCMP. And through that creation, the resistance was defeated. And the reason why I'm saying it's important to acknowledge that the RCMP came out of this, because it's important to acknowledge that the creation of the RCMP was made to dismantle, to kill, and to remove Indigenous people's rights to the land, connection to the land. The RCMP is inherently a colonial and anti-Indigenous organization. And so you have to look at the roots of where it came from. Much like policing in the United States and parts of Canada were created through slave catchers, is the same way the RCMP was created. And so the result was the permanent enforcement of Canadian law in the West, the subjugation of Plains Indigenous people in Canada, and the conviction, hanging, and murder of Louis Riel. And so that's why in Manitoba, we have Louis Riel Day. Oftentimes in Ontario, I believe it's Family Day. Sometimes they fall on the same day. But that is why Louis Riel is regarded as a hero for not just Métis people and Indigenous people, but also for Francophones in the Western provinces and the prairies, because he fought for the right for people to retain their culture and their relationship to the land. We then have the pass system, and this was directly a result of the Northwestern Resistance. So the federal government developed the pass system, and this was a process by which Indigenous people had to present a travel document authorized by an Indian agent in order to leave and return to their reserves. So it didn't matter if you were going to a very close reserve. It didn't matter if you were going for a death in the family or a birth or a wedding or to see your mother. You had to get permission from an Indian agent in order to leave and return. The pass system was a way of controlling the movement of Indigenous people, and it aimed to prevent large gatherings seen by many white settlers as a threat to their settlements. Colonial officials also believed that the pass system would prevent another conflict like the Northwest Resistance. So if you don't allow people to leave their reserves, if you don't allow people to connect with other nations, right, you stop their ability from being able to gather and to advocate on behalf of themselves. It was used in conjunction with the policies such as the Indian Act and residential schools, and the pass system was a part of an overall policy of assimilation. Though it never became a law, the pass system restricted Indigenous freedom in the prairies west during the 19th and early 20th centuries. And so when I say it never became law, it's extremely important to acknowledge that this was done without the consent of the Canadian government. It was not passed through law. It was not something that Canadians as a whole had voted for. This was something that was illegally done. And at the time, the chief of the RCMP, right, said that he didn't actually want to implement this system because it was not legal. And he was told that if he did not enforce it, they would find someone who would. And so imagine you are an Indigenous person and these laws are being used to oppress you and they're not even legal. They were never put on the books. They were never approved. It is just a system of oppression that was established because of prejudice. And it has had a lasting impact on generations of Indigenous people, as restrictions on mobility cause damage to Indigenous economies, cultures, and societies. We then have residential schools and the 60s scoop. And so I'm going to share this short video with you all that talks a bit about what residential schools and the 60s scoop was. And so I understand that a lot of folks now might have an understanding of residential schools, but not many people know about the 60s scoop. And so I'm going to share this video now. I hope folks can hear. I'm pretty sure the sound will go through, but I'm going to play the video now. If you can't hear the video, please let me know in the chat and I'll do some finagling with the technology.
For more than 200 years, religious orders run mission schools for Indigenous children, the precursors to the Government of Canada's residential school system. The Mohawk Institute becomes a boarding school. Run by the Anglican Church, it is the first government-funded residential school in Canada. A government report recommends Indigenous children be separated from their parents in order to assimilate them into Western culture. These recommendations influence federal laws and policies designed to strip Indigenous people of their culture and rights. Isle Cross opens in northern Saskatchewan. The majority of students are Métis. The government takes authority over Indigenous people and education for First Nations. The Indian Act gives the Canadian government control over Indigenous rights and culture. The Act includes only First Nations as status Indians. It excludes Métis and Inuit. Prime Minister John A. Macdonald authorizes the creation of the residential school system, which is designed to isolate Indigenous children from their families and cut all ties to their cultures. The number of schools across Canada quickly climbs to over 40. The Government of Canada requires First Nations children aged 7 to 16 to attend residential school. Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce exposes the government's neglect of Indigenous children's health, including alarmingly high death rates of residential school students. More than 80 institutions are in operation across Canada, the most at any one time. 4 students are investigated for arson. Others reportedly cheer as they watch the school burn. This is one of dozens of fires set by students across Canada as a form of resistance. Inuit children are officially included in the residential school system. 6 schools open in the Western Arctic as the government takes over the administration of many church-run residential schools. Grolier Hall and Stringer Hall open in Inuvik, housing 500 students. More than 20,000 Indigenous children are taken from their families by government social workers and placed in foster care or adoption homes, often with non-Indigenous families. Adoptees lose connection with their Indigenous language, culture, and identity. 12-year-old Chani Wenjak dies after escaping from the Cecilia Jeffrey Residential School. A formal investigation follows. The all-white jury finds that residential schools cause tremendous emotional and psychological problems. The Canadian government takes over responsibility for the remaining schools from the churches. Thousands of Indigenous students are enrolled at the 28 residential schools that are still running in Canada. Phil Fontaine, head of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, speaks publicly of the abuse he suffered at Fort Alexander Indian Residential School. He calls for a public inquiry, which the federal government initiates in 1991. Gordon's Residential School is the last federally run school to close. The report recommends a public inquiry into the effects of residential schools, including language loss and trauma. The government provides compensation to survivors, including the Common Experience Payment and a focus on funding and supporting Indigenous health and healing services. The agreement establishes funds for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or the TRC. Prime Minister Stephen Harper apologizes to former students, their families, and communities for Canada's role in the operation of residential schools. Provincial and territorial apologies follow in the years ahead. After hosting events across Canada, the TRC releases a summary of its findings. It includes 94 calls to action aimed at redressing the legacy of residential schools and assisting in the process of Canadian reconciliation. The News Centre holds a permanent archive of materials and testimonies on residential schools gathered during the TRC. The TRC characterizes Canada's treatment of Indigenous people as cultural genocide. Thousands of children died due to Canada's residential school system. More than 80,000 survivors and their...
Oops. Sorry, folks. I don't know what just happened. It just closed out. Let me just a sec. Technology. I think we were here.
Thousands of children died due to Canada's residential school system. More than 80,000 survivors and their families still live with its legacy.
Many people have said over the years, why can't you just get over it and move on? And my answer has always been, why can't you always remember this? And until people show that they have learned from this, we will never forget.
So the reason why I wanted to share that video is because a lot of folks don't know about the history of residential schools and the fact that it isn't that much in the past, right? The last school closed in 1996. Cassandra has said they opened long before Confederation, and that's absolutely true. Residential schools have been on these lands for a very long time. It's also important to acknowledge that while, yes, the Canadian government has set up a way for survivors of residential schools to get some form of reparations, it's extremely difficult. There was a story that I watched recently about an Indigenous elder who was kidnapped from a residential school and given to a family in the United States. And when she returned home and tried to show proof that she had been taken, the Canadian government wouldn't at first acknowledge it. And she had to go searching. She had to get on a flight to go back to the state that she was in. She had to hope and pray that the elementary school she had gone to for that year that she was taken had records that she was there. And luckily, she was able to find those records, but not everybody can. A friend of mine, her father, at first was denied compensation because his name had been changed, and so therefore wasn't in the records. And so while, yes, there's systems or structures or supports in place for survivors, it's oftentimes extremely difficult for them to access. And they're also forced to relive the horrors that they faced while in residential school or day school. It's important to acknowledge that many 60 Scoop survivors haven't had the opportunity to reconnect with their family. Residential schools in the 60 Scoop, while technically have finished a while ago, are still affecting people to this day. Someone had mentioned earlier the millennial scoop. There's more children in the foster care system now than there ever was at the height of residential schools. There are so many Indigenous children in the foster care system in Manitoba that older Indigenous youth are oftentimes put into motels. And so when we talk about residential schools and we talk about the 60 Scoop, we also have to talk about generational trauma and how that's affected generations to come. So I want to ask you, what are some ways that you think the events mentioned have left long-lasting effects on Indigenous peoples in Canada? And again, you can use the chat or you can unmute yourself if you would like. But I want to know what you think. What are some ways that you think that these events have affected Indigenous people in a long-lasting way? Disconnection from their language, which is a huge part of culture, absolutely. Loss of culture, identity, language, and family. Loss of self-worth, that's a big one. The children did not experience love and therefore had difficulty expressing love to their children. Absolutely. A lot of Indigenous folks talk about the lack of affection that their parents showed because they weren't taught affection. Loss of knowledge of land, plants, and animals, absolutely. Intergenerational trauma, Inuit having one of the highest suicide rates in the world. That is absolutely true. By sending children to residential schools, they were not parented and do not know how to parent, absolutely. Internalized racism, shame, confusion. Vix has shared that their own grandfather was ashamed of his Mi'kmaq identity. Because of this, culture was not being passed down. Absolutely, Vix. My own family dealt with the same thing. My own family was ashamed of who they were and hid their indigeneity. And now I'm the person who's teaching back that knowledge. Addiction, Indigenous being overrepresented in opioid epidemic, absolutely. Mental illness, addiction, no supports. Yes, absolutely. When we talk about addiction in Indigenous communities, we also have to talk about the lack of access to proper resources to deal with mental health issues. So access to ceremony. I met some Indigenous youth from northern Quebec, and they had talked about when they're dealing with mental health issues, they're shipped down to either Ottawa or Montreal and put into facilities with no windows. And so their connection to land and community is cut off. And I wonder how that's supposed to be a support of mental health. Yes, domestic violence, unfortunately, happens within Indigenous families and communities. Canada and the Crown is active in the genocide of Indigenous people. Absolutely. It's important to acknowledge that, right? That Canada is still an active player in the genocide of Indigenous people. That is still taking place. When we think of genocide, we think of genocide as being something of the past, right? We think of genocide happening when Indigenous people were pushed off of their territories, when the buffalo were wiped out, when access to hunting was wiped out, right? But genocide is an ongoing thing and manifests in many different ways. So I want to thank folks for sharing that, for being open and honest about the ways in which they think this affects Indigenous people. Oftentimes, folks talk about, right, addiction. But again, like I said, we don't talk about the causes of that. We don't talk about how Indigenous people suffering from addiction are more in our face because of the lack of access to secure housing for Indigenous people, right? When we see homelessness, oftentimes folks will ask me, well, how come I see so many homeless Native people when they have reserves? Well, A, not everybody has access to building a home on the reserve. And B, because of racist policies and racist ideologies, a lot of Indigenous people, again, do not have access to secure housing. And so I want people to remember that when we see Indigenous people suffering or we see something that makes us uncomfortable, we have to acknowledge where it comes from. So like folks said, when we're talking about effects of colonization, so some of those ongoing effects is the lack of clean drinking water. At any given time, some 100 First Nations are under water advisories. The lack of access to adequate health care, which I mentioned earlier. High rates of suicide, which someone mentioned. First Nation youth are 3 times more likely to commit suicide. Métis youth are 2 times more likely, and Inuit people are 9 times more likely to take their own lives due to the effects of colonization and racism and institutionalized discrimination. Lack of access to resources, to healthcare, to education. There's an overrepresentation in the foster care system. 52% of children in the foster care system are Indigenous children, despite Indigenous children only representing 7.7% of the child population in Canada. An overrepresentation in the prison system. So 30% of people incarcerated in Canada are Indigenous, despite representing only 5% of the general population. So these are the ongoing effects of things like residential schools, the 60 scoop, and other forms of colonization. So it's important to ask yourself, am I a settler? What is your relationship to settlership? So all non-First Nation, Métis, and Inuit folks benefit from settler colonialism. We all benefit, everyone benefits from settler colonialism. But it's important to acknowledge that refugees are not settlers. People who arrived here against their will are not settlers. Settlers are those who are either the descendants of European settlers, those coming to Canada with the intent to settle it, or those coming from countries who benefit from the colonization of these lands. And oftentimes I'll hear folks say, well, my family only immigrated to Canada from this European country 10 years ago. If your country benefited from the colonization of Indigenous lands, you are a settler. And it's important to acknowledge that. It's also important to acknowledge that Black people are not settlers, but may be referred to as arrivants or internal migrants. So those of us who are the descendants of slaves or the descendants of colonization in our lands are oftentimes not here because of our own free will, but instead we're brought here by other means. But again, this does not mean that you are exempt from the responsibility of holding settler colonialism accountable. It does not mean that you do not benefit from the systems that uphold settler colonialism. I can recognize that my father was an arrivant as a descendant of slaves, but also recognize that he was afforded certain privileges and access to healthcare and resources that my mother's own family wasn't able to access. Now, you might feel guilty. You might sit here and feel in your chest, I'm guilty. I'm guilty of benefiting from colonization. I am guilty of being a settler. I'm guilty for upholding these systems. And I want to say guilt is not a useful emotion. It is not something that allows you to be accountable. Oftentimes people feel guilt and then they sit in it. But it's important to feel the guilt and then move through it and ask yourself, how can I do better? And yes, some BIPOC folks and recent immigrants do consider themselves as settlers. And that is important to acknowledge. But it's also, again, important to acknowledge the nuances. Why are you in Canada? How did you arrive here? What are the reasons that you can no longer stay in your own homes? And so I do want people to, acknowledge that relationship to the land. That in the beginning, when I asked you to acknowledge the relationship to the land, many immigrants and refugees and the children of immigrants oftentimes don't know where they fit in that conversation. And it's okay to feel like, you know what, I feel like a settler. I feel like I'm participating in this. Again, it comes down to unpacking those feelings and asking yourself, how do I do better? How do I do better to dismantle settler colonialism? And so I want people to really think about that, right? Like, how do I benefit from it? Oftentimes, folks who are coming from other countries will say, well, I'm a settler because I arrived here recently. And I think about the ways in which Canada, the Canadian government, has destabilized a lot of immigrants' homes, the countries that they come from. I was down in Mexico a few years ago spending time with Indigenous nations in Mexico, the Zapotec communities, Olmec communities, and they talked about the ways in which Canada was destabilizing their region by the ways in which Canadian mining companies were contributing to poverty in those Indigenous communities. Oftentimes, Canada and Canadians are complacent in the colonization of other lands, which then forces their people to relocate here. And so again, I want you, when you're, conflicted about your relationship to settler colonialism, think about the ways in which you or your family have arrived to these lands. And so I want folks to ask themselves, what are some ways that you benefit from settler colonialism? I know I can answer that. Some of the ways that I benefit from settler colonialism, I grew up in Toronto, and so I had access to clean drinking water. I had access to adequate healthcare. Now, did I face racism in the healthcare system? Absolutely, but I could reach a hospital. Some First Nation or Inuit communities have to go 24 hours before they reach the nearest hospital. I benefit by the education system. I know that I was funded $5,000 to $7,000 more than an Indigenous student on reserve. right? Those are some of the ways that I benefit from settler colonialism. So I want you all to share some of the ways that you feel you benefit from settler colonialism. And again, you can put it in the chat or unmute yourself. Someone said access to stable housing. Absolutely. Is there anyone else who wants to share how they access? Okay. Ooh, ability to pursue higher education. Absolutely. Access to travel with a Canadian passport. Absolutely. Growing up with your family, being able to own a house and land. And passports, I think, are such an interesting thing in the way in which many countries won't acknowledge. For instance, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, they issue their own passports, and many countries refuse to acknowledge them. So being acknowledged as a sovereign nation and holding a passport to that sovereign nation is benefiting from settler colonialism. You can move freely, access to education. Being white passing has a lot of privilege. Your appearance is less blatant. Racism, medical care, housing and education, absolutely. I'm a light-skinned Black person, and so I have privilege in that and how I navigate spaces. Access to many employment opportunities, absolutely. There's been a lot of discourse in the Indigenous community around the fact that a lot of darker, more quote unquote res natives are less likely to be employed. There was a conversation that I had with folks a little while ago where we looked around and noticed that one of the places I was working with, there was no one with a res accent, right? That being employed in places. Alberta advantage or benefits, yes. Right? Substance abuse, mental illness is not as stigmatized as much as it is in Indigenous folks, not being stigmatized. White passing is a privilege, the privilege of ignoring events of the past and acting if those are things that are just in the past. Absolutely. Freedom to do whatever you want without criticism, constraints. Absolutely. I was having a conversation yesterday with some folks around the fact that a lot of white settlers and a lot of folks in Canada are able to put blinders on. And you know, there's this joke in the kind of like social justice world where folks are like, I wish I could go back before I was woke because I was so much happier. You know, people talk all the time about, oh, I can't watch this movie without noticing all of the forms of oppression in it. And I want to go back to a time where I didn't see that. And I often think to myself, I wonder if enough people got as uncomfortable as a lot of us are, would things change, right? That ability to actually see what's going on around them. So I want to thank everybody for sharing how they benefit from settler colonialism, because it's really about unpacking with yourself, asking yourself, how do I benefit from these systems? So when we talk about being in solidarity with communities, I oftentimes hear a lot of conversations about fear, right? I'm afraid that I am going to do the wrong thing. I'm afraid to show up because I don't know how, right? A lot of us live in fear. And so when you're thinking about being in solidarity with folks, you have to ask yourself, what am I afraid of? Am I afraid of losing my job? Am I afraid of losing family because I'm standing up for injustices? I hear that a lot. I had a friend come to me once and she said, you know, I'm afraid to confront my family because I'm afraid I'm going to lose them. And that oftentimes happens. People will see discrimination or racism in the workplace and they're afraid to confront it because they're afraid of losing their job. And so when you start to feel kind of, you know, about being in solidarity with people, not because you don't want to, but because you're afraid, sit down and list the things that you're afraid of and ask yourself why. Now, there are some myths that non-Indigenous racialized people are told when it comes to their relationship to settler colonialism into Canada. Oftentimes, they're told that they owe the settler state for their lives. And this is oftentimes told to immigrants as well, whether you're racialized or not. That you can't confront colonialism and anti-Indigenous racism in Canada because you owe the settler state your lives. You owe them the right to be here. That you should be thankful to be here, and that's why you shouldn't confront forms of injustice in Canada. And that fighting against the state makes you look ungrateful. And oftentimes, non-Indigenous racialized folks or immigrants or refugees are told we're dishonoring our parents or grandparents when we criticize the colonial state. And so these are some things that folks are afraid of when they want to be in solidarity with community. And to be honest, these are things that you might even be told even if you are white, are a white settler or of white ancestry. You might be told some of these very same things, especially if your family has fought in any of the wars. I've heard this a lot. My grandfather fought for this freedom, and so if I combat the government, it's dishonoring his memory, right? These are some of the things, the lies, the myths that we tell ourselves to stop ourselves or to keep us afraid of supporting Indigenous people. And so the question is, how can I fight for my community's liberation in non-harmful ways? Right? If you're someone who's from another marginalized community, so say you're queer or disabled or someone with mental health issues, right? Because oftentimes I'll hear folks that are like, okay, well, you know, I'm white or I'm non-Indigenous and I really want to fight for this issue alongside Indigenous people. Or I want to include Indigenous people for fighting for liberations on these lands. And these are some of the ways that you can include Indigenous people in solidarity in liberation fights. So one way is inviting elders to be a part of your events or discussions. And when I say inviting elders, I don't mean inviting them for 2 seconds to do a land acknowledgement. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that I want you to invite elders in real and concrete ways. Include them throughout whatever event you're doing or discussion. Reach out to nations whose lands you're on so that you can hear what it is they're doing. What forms of resistance are they doing? How can you be in solidarity with them? Look to see what's already being done. Oftentimes, we replicate what's already out there because we haven't taken the time to be in solidarity with community. Buy materials and supplies from Indigenous businesses. If you're having an event, invite an Indigenous chef or cook. If you need supplies, say you want to do a medicine workshop. I've seen people do medicine workshops and buy their supplies from non-Indigenous people, right? Make sure that what you're doing is supporting Indigenous people. And then acknowledge the communities around you. So we did that at the beginning, right? I asked you all to list where you are from and your connection to the land and your connection to those people, because it's important. So how can you be in solidarity? Now, it's important to acknowledge that solidarity can look like many different things. Sometimes people will tell me, oh, well, I don't have the capacity to go out and march. And that's okay. How are you going to be in solidarity with communities in other ways? Actions are also dependent on the community that you're wishing to be in support of. Like I said earlier, what works for someone in Nunavut might not work for somebody in Mi'kmaq territory, which might not work for somebody in Salish territory. We all are looking for different things from community to be in solidarity with us. Oftentimes when there's actions, Again, when folks say they can't physically be out there, they want to know, well, how else can I support the community? And sometimes it's bodies, it's showing up, but other times it's monetary. Maybe it's you cooking a meal. Maybe it's you cleaning up. Maybe it's checking in on elders who are far away from family and community. Ottawa has a huge Inuit population. And oftentimes, elders are far away from their families. So even taking the time to just go and check in, to sit with them, right? Being in solidarity looks different for everyone. But that being said, there are some key things that you can do to be in solidarity with Indigenous peoples. And attending trainings and workshops are a great example, Cassandra. So number one is your positionality. Remember, I started with my positionality. So take a step back and unpack your positionality. How have you and your family come to be on these lands? That's a really important thing to acknowledge. How did I come to be here? In what way? Acknowledging whose land you are on and what are their traditional names for themselves and the places that you have lived. I love to see that people referring to Haudenosaunee folks as Haudenosaunee versus Iroquois. Referring to Anishinaabe people as Anishinaabe. Right? It's important that when you're in relationship with Indigenous communities that you're using the terms that they wish to be used for them. It's easy to pronounce the anglicized versions, but it takes real commitment and solidarity to learn the traditional names for these communities. Even the place names of where you are. When I say I'm from Adopakong, it's me acknowledging the traditional name for the area that I'm in. Even if anyone's ever been to the Native Canadian Center, which is at, I believe it's Spadina and Bloor. Spadina is a Anishinaabe word, a Ishpadina, and it refers to the place of many hills, a hilly place. Ishpadina is an Anishinaabe word. Many of us live and are located in places that are named after Indigenous nations, named after Indigenous words. It's important to know those. It's important to ask yourself, what privileges do I have? That's a big one. It's really hard to acknowledge our privileges. There's this privilege activity that I do with folks. And one of the privileges is if you grew up in a home with more than 50 books. And oftentimes people will be like, well, that doesn't really seem like a privilege. Access to literature is a privilege. Access to resources is a privilege. And so you have to ask yourself, you have to unpack yourself and ask, what privileges do I have? How do I benefit? Next is, what steps have I taken to be in support of Indigenous peoples? If you've taken no steps, well, this is the first one. But you need to ask yourself, what other ways have I supported Indigenous people? Have I spoken up in spaces? Have I advocated? Have I created opportunities? Right? These are things to ask yourself. And the last one around positionality is, what are you willing to give up? I've heard people say oftentimes equity is not about giving things up. No, it is. Equity is about giving up your privileges. And it's important to ask yourself, in order to be in solidarity with Indigenous people, what will I give up? And that's a really hard question. It's a really hard question to ask yourself, okay, what am I willing to let go of to actually be in solidarity with Indigenous people? Next is education. And this is extremely important. Folks, education is out there. All of this information is readily accessible to you. You can go on Google and find TED Talks, movies, literature, peer-reviewed literature. You can find just about anything that is coming from the voices of Indigenous people. So you can watch movies and documentaries, and I have a list here. There's The Real Injun, The Canary Effect, Indian Horse, Rhymes for Young Ghouls, Angry Anook, Foster Child, and there's so many more Indigenous movies out there, documentaries that you can watch that are written by and for Indigenous peoples. You can read books, In Search of April Raintree, The Inconvenient Indians, Seven Fallen Feathers, Birdie. All of these books are written by Indigenous people, sharing the perspectives of Indigenous people. To be honest, reading any of Leanne Simpson's work is an insight to Indigenous perspectives. And I highly recommend looking into Leanne Simpson. You can watch TED-Eds, and these are specific names for ones that you can search. So Canadian Shame, A History of Residential Schools with Ginger Gosselin Myers. Identity and Post-Secondary, A First Nations Experience with Amy Smoke. And The Art of Survival, A Modern Day Inuit Odyssey Through the Arts with Sophia Lebesis. And then lastly, you can talk to Indigenous peoples. But what I want to say is that if you're going to be seeking out Indigenous peoples, make sure that you're checking in with them about their capacity. I don't know how many times I've just had folks flood my inbox asking me questions without saying, hey, Shanese, do you have the capacity right now to have this conversation? Do you have the capacity to sit and listen to what I have to say and the questions that I have? Those are things that you have to ask Indigenous people. Also, make sure that the questions that you are asking are relevant to that Indigenous person in their community. So I once had someone ask me about Navajo spirits, and I responded, hey, I'll have to Google just like you would. I am not Navajo. So make sure that when you're reaching out to people and communities and nations, that you're asking questions that are relevant to them. And lastly, compensate Indigenous people for the knowledge that they're sharing with you. And compensation can look different for each person. Some might ask for monetary compensation. Maybe they'll ask for you to buy their groceries or to come and show up for an event. But make sure that you are compensating folks for the knowledge that they're sharing with you. And lastly, showing up. So look for actions taking place in your area. Indigenous people are continuously fighting for their rights, and they are giving people opportunities continuously to show up. Donate to Indigenous causes and communities. Again, money, food, time, resources, whatever you have the capacity to offer. It's important to not speak over or for Indigenous peoples when you do show up. It's important to give up positions of power to Indigenous peoples. And that's a scary one. Looking around and being like, oh, shoot, I might have to give up my job or this speaking opportunity. I don't know how many times I've been booked for things and I've said, actually, I'm not the person to speak to this. Giving up power is a great way to show solidarity. Educating others. So if you're at the dinner table with your family and someone makes an anti-Indigenous remark, taking the time to educate them. And also providing them, again, with those resources by Indigenous people. And create an action plan. Sit with yourself and ask yourself, okay, how am I going to show up? What are the things that I can do? Those are the ways in which you can be in solidarity with Indigenous people. Cassandra, that's great. Yes, directing people to trainings, volunteer opportunities, options to be in community with folks. And so that brings us to the end of this presentation, this workshop. I'm so thankful to each and every one of you who's participated. For those who've had to leave, thank you for being here. Um, I will open it up to questions now. And it's also okay if folks don't have questions yet. This was a lot of information. And so if you have questions that you want to pass on to Erin to then pass on to me, by all means, feel free to do so. And I can definitely share answers to those questions. I appreciate everyone saying thank you. I want to say thank you for being in community with me today and participating in this conversation and sharing yourself. Being vulnerable during a conversation where I've asked you to think about your privilege and how you uplift settler colonialism, that takes a lot. And so I appreciate you.
All right, it doesn't look like any questions are coming through. So on behalf of the Equal Futures Network, Shanese, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom. This session was absolutely incredible and so much depth and so many, great building blocks for moving forward. I think really you being able to meet us all where we're at and provide some really concrete, actionable ways to do this work in a good way is just, we can never express our gratitude for that. So thank you. And, if there are no questions, we'll hold the floor open for maybe 3 more minutes and then I'll end the call. But yeah, feel free to drop off if there's nothing, and look forward to getting the recording out to you and anything else in the next couple of days. So thank you all for joining us and giving up your time.